What if the most unsettling question humanity ever asked was not born in science fiction, but quietly embedded in the logic of reality itself? Long before computers, before code, before silicon and screens, people were already haunted by the feeling that something about the world does not fully add up. Plato called it the cave. Modern culture calls it the matrix. Today, physicists call it a hypothesis. Are we living in a simulation? It sounds like clickbait, like a cheap trick designed to hijack attention. But the reason it refuses to die is simple. Every time we dig deeper into the structure of reality, it starts behaving less like a natural landscape and more like a constructed system. Discrete units, finite limits, rules that look suspiciously like code. And here is the uncomfortable part. The simulation idea is not driven by mysticism or conspiracy. It emerges naturally from mathematics, computer science, and physics. If the universe can be described entirely by equations, and if equations can be computed, then the line between reality and computation becomes dangerously thin. You do not need an evil supercomputer to make this disturbing. All you need is progress. If intelligent civilizations tend to develop advanced computing, and if advanced computing allows the simulation of entire worlds, then statistically, simulated observers should vastly outnumber original ones. That is not philosophy. That is probability. And probability does not care about how uncomfortable the conclusion feels. But before we panic, before we declare reality fake and meaning obsolete, we need to slow down, because the real danger is not the simulation itself. The danger is misunderstanding what it would actually imply. If this is a simulation, it does not mean your experiences are meaningless. Pain still hurts. Love still binds. Choices still shape outcomes. A simulated fire burns just as real to the one inside it. The question is not whether reality is fake. The question is whether reality requires being fundamental to matter. And this is where modern physics steps onto unstable ground. Because the deeper we go, the more the universe behaves like an interface rather than a thing. Space and time appear quantized. Information seems conserved more strictly than matter. Even black holes, once thought to destroy information, now appear to preserve it. The universe does not just contain information, it behaves like information. And if that makes you uneasy, it should. Because if reality is informational at its core, then the idea that it could be instantiated, replayed or computed elsewhere is no longer absurd. It becomes inevitable. But here is the twist. Even if this is a simulation, there may be no way out, no way to prove it, and no way to meaningfully distinguish it from a base reality. Which raises a far more disturbing question than whether we are simulated. What if the universe is structured in such a way that the question itself is unanswerable? At some point, you understand that morality without leverage is decoration. It looks noble, it sounds correct, but it does not protect you when pressure arrives. The world tests boundaries, not intentions, and the people who move forward are rarely the most virtuous. They are the ones who learned how to say no without explaining, how to withdraw without apologizing, how to stand their ground without raising their voice. Power does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly through consistency. When you always yield, people stop seeing your kindness as a choice and start seeing it as an obligation. That is the moment respect dies. Not because others are evil, but because human psychology interprets predictability as weakness. What cannot be anticipated cannot be exploited. This is why restraint feels uncomfortable at first. You were trained to smooth tension, to resolve conflict quickly, to make everyone feel safe. But safety is not the same as authority. Authority is built when others know you could act, but choose not to unless necessary. The strongest presence in a room is often the person who speaks last, not because they are slow, but because they are selective. They let others expose their motives, their impatience, their fear of uncertainty. And in that exposure, hierarchy forms naturally. You do not need to dominate to be dominant. You need gravity. Gravity pulls without effort. It does not chase. It does not persuade. It simply exists, and everything adjusts around it. When you stop performing goodness for approval and start practicing discipline for yourself, something shifts internally. You become harder to move, harder to rush, harder to corner. People sense it before they understand it. They speak differently to you. They hesitate. They listen. This is not manipulation. This is alignment. You are no longer leaking energy trying to be understood. You are conserving it, and conserved energy always reads as strength. The paradox is simple. The more you try to prove you are good, the less impact you have. The moment you stop proving and start choosing, your presence sharpens. Goodness becomes dangerous when it is voluntary, when it is backed by the ability to walk away, when it is paired with boundaries that do not bend under pressure. This is the transition. From being liked to being respected, from being available to being valued, from being harmless to being intentional. And once you cross it, there is no return to the old role, because you finally understand that the world does not reward purity. It responds to balance. There is a quiet shift that happens when you stop explaining yourself. At first it feels wrong, almost immoral, as if silence were a betrayal of who you used to be. You were taught that clarity equals honesty, that transparency builds trust, that if people misunderstand you, it is your duty to correct them. But this belief turns into a trap the moment you realize how often explanations are not requested for understanding, but for control. Every extra word gives others material. Every justification creates a handle. The more you speak, the more predictable you become. And predictability is the currency of manipulation. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is not absence. It is compression. It concentrates meaning. When you respond less, your words gain weight. When you pause, others rush to fill the space, revealing their impatience, their assumptions, their need for dominance. You begin to see how often conversations are not exchanges of truth, but negotiations of position. This is where power quietly reorganizes itself. Not through aggression, not through confrontation, but through withdrawal. You are no longer reacting on demand. You are choosing when to engage. That choice alone changes how you are perceived. People test less when tests no longer produce reactions. They respect what they cannot easily read. This is why calm unsettles those who rely on emotional leverage. They expect resistance or compliance, not neutrality. Neutrality breaks scripts. It forces others to confront their own intent, and intent exposed is intent weakened. Over time, this restraint builds an inner structure. You become harder to provoke, harder to guilt, harder to rush into decisions that do not serve you. This is not coldness. It is coherence. Your actions align with your values without the need for performance. You stop auditioning for approval. You stop negotiating your worth. You begin to understand that real influence does not come from being understood by everyone, but from being misread by those who wish to use you. The most dangerous position is not to be loved or feared, but to be unnecessary to convince. When you no longer need to explain why you chose what you chose, you reclaim authorship of your life. And authorship is the foundation of all power. At some point, something subtle but irreversible happens inside you. You stop asking why people take advantage of you, and you start noticing the pattern behind it. Not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a cold clarity that feels almost inhuman. You realize that the world is not divided into good and bad people, but into those who understand power and those who pretend it doesn't exist. Until now, you lived as if intentions mattered more than outcomes, as if purity of heart could compensate for lack of boundaries. But power does not respond to intentions. Power responds to structure, timing, and presence. This is the moment where many people retreat. They feel shame for even thinking this way, as if recognizing the mechanics of dominance somehow stains their soul. But awareness is not corruption. Awareness is vision, and vision changes everything. You begin to see how often people test you in small ways, how they interrupt you slightly more than others, how your time is assumed to be available, how your patience is mistaken for permission. None of this is dramatic. That's the danger. It happens quietly, incrementally, like water eroding stone. And the most unsettling realization is this: they don't do it because they are evil. They do it because you allow it to happen. Not consciously, not deliberately, but energetically. You project openness without weight, kindness without consequence, and the world reads that signal perfectly. This is where inner recalibration begins. You don't become louder. You don't become cruel. You become denser. Your words shorten. Your reactions slow. Your availability becomes selective. You stop explaining yourself to people who never listened in the first place. You stop justifying boundaries as if they were crimes. Silence becomes a tool, not a void. And something strange happens when you do this. People start behaving differently around you, not because you threatened them, not because you demanded respect, but because uncertainty has entered the equation. You are no longer predictable. And unpredictability, when grounded in calm, is power. You may feel lonely here. This stage often feels like exile from your former self. The version of you that overgave, overexplained, overextended will try to pull you back with guilt. But that version was surviving, not living. What you are building now is not armor made of aggression, but gravity made of self-containment. You are learning that you do not need to prove your goodness. You need to protect it. And protection does not look like softness. It looks like stillness. It looks like restraint. It looks like choosing when to engage and when to let silence do the work. This is not the death of kindness. It is its evolution. Kindness that can walk away. Kindness that does not beg to be understood. kindness that does not collapse under pressure. You are no longer trying to be liked, you are becoming unignorable. There comes a moment when you realize that strength is not built by confrontation but by endurance. Not by winning arguments, but by surviving them without losing yourself. Most people think power looks loud. They imagine dominance as raised voices, sharp words, visible control. But real power rarely announces itself. It settles into the room quietly and waits. By now, you have probably noticed a pattern. The people who provoke the most reaction control the least. They need feedback. They need resistance. They need you to move so they can feel real. When you stop reacting, something shifts, not immediately. At first, they push harder. They test, they escalate. Silence feels threatening to those who live by noise. But if you hold your ground without explanation, without apology, without visible emotion, something uncomfortable happens. They lose their leverage. Power does not come from force. It comes from asymmetry, from being less invested than the person trying to pull you into their frame. This is where most people fail. They mistake restraint for weakness because they have never felt the strength it requires. It takes discipline to not correct every misunderstanding. It takes clarity to let others misjudge you without rushing to repair your image. The need to be understood is one of the most exploitable human traits. Once someone knows you crave validation, they can withhold it. Once they know you fear being seen as cold, they can push until you react. But when you detach from that need, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability changes the balance. You are no longer playing defense. You are not playing at all. This does not mean becoming distant or cruel. It means choosing where your energy goes. Attention is finite. Presence is currency. When you give it everywhere, it is worth nothing. When you give it selectively, it gains weight. People begin to feel your absence more than your presence. That is when respect appears not because you demanded it, but because you stop chasing it. You start to notice something else too. Your nervous system slows. Your thoughts sharpen. You no longer rehearse conversations in your head at night. You no longer explain yourself to people who already decided not to listen. This is not indifference. This is alignment. You are no longer trying to be seen as strong. You are strong enough to be misread. That is the turning point. The moment you understand that control over yourself is the only control that lasts. From here forward, you move differently. You speak less, but your words land heavier. You show up less, but your presence lingers longer. And those who once tested your limits begin to adjust their behavior without you ever having to say a word. This is the quiet architecture of authority, built not from dominance but from self-possession. Eventually, you begin to notice the reversal. It is subtle at first, almost unrecognizable unless you are paying attention. The people who once dominated conversations now hesitate before speaking to you. The ones who pushed your boundaries now test the air before stepping closer. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no confrontation, no announcement, no declaration of change. You simply stopped feeding the old dynamic. And without fuel, it started to collapse. This is the phase most people misinterpret. They think respect comes from being louder, more assertive, more visible. But what actually happens is the opposite. When you remove emotional access, you force others to recalibrate. Humans are deeply sensitive to shifts in attention. When someone who used to explain justify or react suddenly does none of those things, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is destabilizing. Not because you became hostile, but because you became opaque. People can tolerate disagreement. What they struggle with is unreadability, the inability to predict your response. That is when behavior changes. Some will try to provoke you again, hoping to restore the old pattern. Others will withdraw, sensing that their usual tools no longer work. And a few will begin to respect you quietly, without ever admitting why. This is where your discipline is tested. The temptation is to explain the change, to seek recognition for your growth, to finally be seen as different. But that would undo everything. Power gained through silence is lost through explanation. The moment you justify your boundaries, you turn them into negotiations. The moment you clarify your detachment, you invite interpretation. So you do nothing. You let the shift speak for itself, and something unexpected happens inside you as well. You start to feel less crowded. Your thoughts are no longer interrupted by imagined conversations. You no longer rehearse defenses that may never be needed. Your inner world becomes quieter, not empty, but orderly. From that order comes precision. You choose words carefully. You choose people carefully. You choose battles rarely. And because of that, when you do engage, it matters. This is not emotional coldness. It is emotional economy. You are no longer spending energy where it cannot grow. You are no longer explaining your value to those who benefit from misunderstanding it. Instead, you let consistency do the work. Over time, people stop asking why you changed. They simply adjust. Some drift away because the version of you they relied on no longer exists. Others stay but interact differently with more caution, more respect, more awareness. You do not correct them, you observe. Observation is the final form of control. When you stop trying to influence outcomes directly, you gain the ability to shape them indirectly, by presence, by absence, by timing. This is when you understand that dominance is fragile but self-command is permanent. To understand why the simulation hypothesis refuses to disappear, we must stop relying on intuition and examine how modern physics actually describes reality at its deepest level. The universe does not behave like a smooth, infinite continuum. Instead, it operates within limits. Energy appears in discrete packets. Space seems to have a smallest measurable scale. Time progresses in steps that cannot be divided endlessly. These are not metaphors or philosophical tricks, but experimental observations, confirmed by quantum mechanics and information theory. A universe with hard limits does not prove artificiality, but it aligns disturbingly well with computation. Physics no longer describes solid objects in the classical sense. It describes states, probabilities, transitions, and constraints. A particle is not a tiny object, but a mathematical rule governing how information behaves when observed. Forces are not physical pushes, but interactions encoded in equations. What we experience as solidity and continuity emerges from abstract rules, operating beneath perception. This abstraction matters because computation thrives on abstraction. The idea that reality could be simulated did not originate in science fiction. It emerged from scientists, noticing that the universe already behaves like something that could, in principle, be calculated. Not easily, not efficiently, but theoretically. And once something is theoretically computable, the door never fully closes. This leads to the disturbing statistical argument. If a technological civilization can simulate conscious observers, and if simulations require fewer resources than base reality, then simulations will vastly outnumber originals. One real civilization could host millions of simulated worlds, each containing observers who feel real, think freely, and question their existence just as we do. From the inside, nothing would feel artificial, because computation does not feel like computation when you are the process being computed. Pain does not feel synthetic because it is calculated. Fear does not feel false because it emerges from code. Meaning does not disappear because the substrate changes. The universe you experience is the only universe you ever interact with. And this is where the discomfort truly begins. Not because we lack proof, but because proof may not matter at all. If the universe were a simulation, it would not announce itself with glitches or flashing warnings. It would reveal itself through silence, through limits, through the quiet realization that reality behaves less like an infinite continuum and more like a system with boundaries. Physics, when pushed far enough, does not open into freedom. It closes in on constraints, maximum speeds, minimum lengths, discrete packets of energy, Planck units that act like pixels beneath the surface of space and time. These are not poetic metaphors. They are measurements, and they raise an uncomfortable question. Why does reality seem optimized for calculation? Why does nature refuse infinities the way computers do? Every time equations produce infinity, physics breaks down and must be repaired, renormalized, cut, off, smoothed, as if the universe itself rejects values it cannot process. Some physicists argue this is merely a limitation of our models. Others suspect it may be a feature of reality itself. Consider this. If you were designing a universe to simulate conscious beings, you would not allow infinite precision. You would impose limits to save resources. You would discretize space, cap speeds, quantize energy. And remarkably, that is exactly the universe we observe. Even randomness may not be what it seems. Quantum uncertainty is often described as fundamental chaos, but randomness in computing is rarely truly random. It is generated by algorithms that produce outcomes indistinguishable from chance, within defined limits. We cannot prove quantum randomness is fake, but we also cannot prove it is not. From the inside of a system, true randomness and perfect pseudo-randomness are observationally identical. This is where the hypothesis becomes dangerous, because it does not require belief. It requires humility. It asks whether our confidence in reality is based on truth or on the inability to test beyond the walls of our perception. You cannot step outside the universe to inspect it. You cannot observe the system from the outside. All experiments are internal, all measurements are confined, and every answer we obtain is filtered through rules we did not choose. If this is not a simulation, it behaves uncomfortably like one. Not because it looks artificial, but because it is efficient, constrained, and silent about what lies beyond its limits. And silence in science is never meaningless. At some point, you stop asking why the world treats you this way and start asking a far more dangerous question: what if nothing is wrong with me? What if I was simply too available, too transparent, too easy to read? The truth most people never accept is that life does not reward goodness, it responds to boundaries. The moment you stop explaining yourself, the moment you stop overgiving, the moment you stop proving your value, something shifts, not because you became colder, but because you became solid. You no longer leak your energy into rooms that do not deserve it. You no longer perform kindness out of fear of rejection. You choose it, and choice is power. The world listens differently when you are no longer asking to be heard. Silence becomes weight. Restraint becomes authority, and absence becomes a language louder than any justification. This is where real strength lives, not in domination, not in cruelty, but in self-possession. You do not need to harden your heart. You need to anchor it. You need to stop mistaking accessibility for virtue and endurance for nobility. People respect what they cannot casually reach. They value what does not beg to stay, and they remember those who leave without burning bridges or slamming doors, just quiet footsteps and certainty. If there is one truth you should carry forward, it is this: goodness is not meant to be drained. Goodness is meant to be directed. Protect it. Choose where it flows, and never again confuse being kind with being disposable. When you walk away without resentment, when you stand still without fear, when you speak only when it matters, you stop being a background character in other people's lives and start becoming a presence that alters the room without saying a word. This is not the end of who you are, it is the beginning of who you allow to reach you